Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to do a video on microclimates. I'm going to talk about 4 different ways that you can create a microclimate, and each has subcategories. And then I'm going to go around my property. Now that it's kind of wintertime and things have died back, it's actually easier for me to show you different microclimates that I've set up. And I'll go show you some examples of things that I've set up in that area. And hopefully that way you can use a little bit of science in order to make your plants grow in the best possible spot. And most importantly, you can expand the range of things that you can grow on your property if you have a whole bunch of different microclimates making slightly better conditions for each different type of plant. You can really boost your diversity that way. So let's get started. Let's go explore my property and we'll check out some different microclimates. Let's go. Okay, so first let's talk about what the different microclimates are. We're going to be messing around with sun, water, wind, and thermal mass. Now for sun, you can have full sun, full shade, you can have dappled shade, and you can actually have a gradient. We'll talk about that in a bit. For water, you can have dry, damp, and you can have a gradient. For wind, you can either have full wind exposure or a wind break. And for thermal mass, you can either have a significant amount of thermal mass or you can have no thermal mass. And we'll talk about what thermal mass even is and how it impacts the conditions. Now, more than that, for each one of those combinations, you can have a different set of, full sun, but wet, windbreak, and no thermal mass. That's one microclimate. That's one condition of the local growing area. And because we have so many combinations, there's actually 48. If you go through the math, there's 48 different possible microclimates. So I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'll talk about the ways that they interact and influence each other and how that can affect what you can grow in that area. So let's go take a look at some of those. Hey baby, come on. Come on. Let's go to the garden. Like how she's got her stick pile. Our little toys. Come on. Okay, now it's a shady day, but this annual garden here with the raspberry patch is set up in a full sun, dry, windbreak on the northern wall, zero thermal mass environment. This is a great environment for if you want to grow annual vegetables. You want full sun, and for sun, you're always looking to the south. South for us is completely this way. So this annual garden bed gets the most amount of sun of anywhere on my property. For windbreak, you're looking at the northern edge, if you're in the northern hemisphere, the northern edge of your property, or wherever the prevailing winds come from you in your area. For us, it's roughly north-northeast. So this is basically a giant wall that's going to block wind coming in. It's a fairly dry site because this is slightly uphill of the general contour of the land. If I kind of zoom back a bit, you can see the slope kind of goes this way a little bit. So any rain that falls will fall down off the slope. We get quite a bit of rain here where we are. So my driest area is going to be nowhere near as dry as someone in Arizona, for example. But this is the drier area of my land, and this is a great place for any kind of high production, quick turnaround, leafy green plants. But please forgive the mess of the leaf bags. But the reason why I like my annual garden to be in a driest area is that first off, we're a fairly wet climate. So if I put it in a lowland area, I'm gonna have really problems with getting too much moisture. Second is that we've got an artesian well overflow right here. So I have access to as much water as I could possibly want to pump up to the annual garden bed. If you are in a drier climate, then you might want to put your annual garden bed in the wettest low-lying place on your property. You might even want to do sunken beds so that any rainfall gets captured and stored in the sunken gardens. So whatever your climate is, you're going to try to off balance and create kind of a more moderated area for you to grow your annuals in. Now, I mentioned the word moderated, and what that word means is essentially if you had a wide, bare, open patch of land, say just an open field like a monoculture of corn that was just cut and now it's just bare dirt, the temperature profile of that soil during the day and the nighttime is going to be very drastic. It's going to be very, very high temperature and dry during the day, and it'll be very, very cold at night. And the temperature will cycle very, very drastically as the days go by. An area with thermal mass or shade or a windbreak will be more moderated. And that means instead of a big sawtooth curve where it goes really hot, really cold between day and night, it'll just kind of smooth it out, and you'll get a smoother oscillation of lower highs and higher lows than you would otherwise. Building moderation into your garden plans is very, very important because plants want stability. They don't want to cycle through these extremes. Outside of the odd outlier plant who outcompeted other plants in that specific niche, most plants want a fairly moderated temperature profile, water profile, and through the creation of these microclimates, you can use the weakness of one and you can add some kind of feature of another type of microclimate to kind of moderate what it would normally experience. Now let's talk about sun. This is south for us. So in the morning when the sun rises over here, the house is blocking for pretty much most of this garden, has a giant shadow of a house. And then in the midday, it'll get basically full sun, and then the sun will hide behind these cedar trees in the afternoon. So it gets full sun in the midday, but it gets shaded in the early day. So some plants do really well in this front area. And when I go further back this way, now I'm removing the early sun from the shade of the house, and these are getting full sun pretty much right until the sun hits behind these cedars, and then it'll kind of pop back out when it sets over there. So this area here is a full sun location on my property, and because of that, it's a high value space for fruit trees. And this is a big reason why I wanted to expand the food forest out this way, because I'm pulling away from the shading of these cedar trees, and I can get a lot of value in full sun hours on the south side of some of these really large maples. On the other hand, the garden beds behind the maples, I got that one maple, and then I have this one here and another one there. This front roadside garden is basically a shade garden because it's on the north side of these giant maple trees. So in that area, I plant shade-loving plants like currants, like elderberries. We've got hostas back there. And on the north or on the south side of that tree, that's where I'm going to put some of the more fruit trees that I really care about higher production, and the Mediterranean style herbs that need maybe a little bit more full sun. For sun, you can also get dappled sun. And this is where you'll have an overstory tree, but a tree with kind of skinny, thin leaves. And I don't really have a great example of dappled sun to show you around my property. But if you have, for example, a lot of black locust trees, they'll give a nice dappled shade to the soil level. And those are great areas for starting new plants. It's a great area to create your tree nursery, because that is where in the wild in the dappled areas under an existing mother plant that's protecting her babies. This is where the seeds are being dropped down, and this is the environment that trees will want to germinate in. So if you have a lot of dappled shade, a lot of dappled sun, then that's where you want to be planting your brand new fruit trees and create a brand new fruit tree nursery. So let's talk water now. Now for water, I don't necessarily just mean rainfall. I mean, where does that rainfall go? Both on the land and below the soil. Typically, highlands will be the drier area of your general climate, and the lowlands, especially kind of basins, will be where all that water accumulates. So your dry areas are going to be highlands and hills as well. And the way that we moderate a dry area so that it's more balanced is with the use of swales. Now this is a south-facing hill, so south-facing means it has a lot of valuable light for me. And I've cut in a swale, which is essentially a trench on contour. You take the soil and you put it on the downhill side to make a hill, a berm, and that will stop any rain that wants to flow down the hill. It'll stop it, hold it, and then that water will sink into the ground where it won't evaporate away as quickly. Now the goal of a swale isn't to hold the water. The goal of it is to slow it, stop it, spread it, and sink it. So where you have a swale, or a hill, you'll naturally have a very dry area. And if you can cut a swale in, then you'll moderate that dryness, and you'll kind of create a bit of a more medium balance between water and wet and dry. And just popping up here so I can show you another swale that I cut in. Sometimes it's hard when the grasses and everything are a little overgrown, but I've cut in a swale here that goes right along this whole entire side of the hill, and we'll kind of go walk it down. And into the berm side, I've planted all my trees. And you can really see the swale here continue right across. And what that swale will do is the water that gets stuck in it will go underground, and it'll create this plume that goes under the ground for quite a ways. Now the steeper that your hill is, that bloom will penetrate further and further down. And on really steep swales, the area of fertility might be quite a bit down the hill. So you want to plant trees not just on the berm, but all the way down. And this whole general area, I'm going to be continuing to plant out further and further down, because I believe that the most fertile areas are kind of down here. Now for this particular area, the reason why I haven't done that yet is because of these southern cedars on the southern side creating a sunblock. So this is a fairly high shade, but dry because of naturally dry, but moderated because of the swale. So I can actually fit in a little fruit tree guild down here on the south side, because this is where the plume water underground will kind of go. And we've got a little bit of a guild of blackberries, linden, pawpaw, raspberries, a whole bunch of stuff. And one thing I've noticed is the mushrooms do fantastic down here because of the shade. So where you have water storage and you've got shade, that is a great area for mushrooms. And this is probably where I pull the most amount of mushrooms in my property out of this small little guild. Okay, now we're in my lowest area, and this is where all the water on my property will collect until it heads off into the stream that you can probably hear just on the downhill side of this little berm. This area is pretty much dappled sun or low sun, just due to all the southern trees down here. But it's very wet, and it's the perfect place for a pawpaw guild. Trees that want fairly low sun while they're young, but then they'll get up and they'll be able to get into they have the availability to get sun eventually once they get a little taller. But while they're small, they're fairly shaded out down here. This is the perfect place for plants like that. Now coming down a little bit further, we have conditions getting even wetter and slightly more sunny actually. So down in here, we have planted out a small little guild here that we're going to probably add more trees to later on, because it gets pretty good sun coming in, and this is the lowest area. All the water from all around here will end up collecting here, even though I've kind of designed some of these pathways on contour to stop it and hold it and soak it. This is going to be a great area, and I've planted some willows in here for now, and I might use it as a nursery bed for plants that really do want a lot of moisture, and then I'll eventually transition it into any kind of plant that wants fairly wet conditions, but decent amount of sun. This will be a great place for that. Now, if you're not sure what kind of conditions your plant likes, a great resource is called Plants for a Future, pfaf.org. That's the website. You can look up your plant, so you can just say, look up apples PFAF, lemon PFAF, and it'll tell you the conditions and environment that the plant optimally grows in, and then you can create the micro niche, the microclimate, in order to optimally give that plant the conditions that it wants. Okay, so now we'll head up to the pond and we'll talk about thermal mass, what that does for the soil temperature profiles, and how you can use that to your advantage. And maybe I'll just remind you guys that we have a membership program if you want to support the channel. Check it out down below. And also you can like and subscribe and hit all that notification bell and all that kind of jazz that helps out with the YouTube algorithm, you know, promoting this channel to new people. Let's talk about thermal mass. Now, thermal mass is anything that stores and hold heat very well. Specifically, it's about its specific heat capacity, its CV value for you engineering nerds out there. And basically what you're trying to do is collect and hold the sun's heat inside of something so that it stays cooler in the area around it, because it's collecting the sun's heat during the day, but then at night it will radiate that heat back out and keep the nighttime temperatures higher. And what that really does is it takes that temperature profile that's bouncing between highs and lows, and it really makes it steady. The way that you do that, the easiest, is with rocks and water. And for anyone wondering why this hill looks so crazy and wild right now, it's because it's so beneficial for the insects to leave stuff like this up, to let your plants go do their thing. So make sure you check out my previous video to this where I discuss that, and consider not cleaning up your gardens until the spring. Let the plants do what they do, and that'll really benefit your insects, which will increase the amount of predators that you have, as well as pollinators. So you'll get better set on your fruit and you'll have less pest issues. But for thermal mass, let's talk about this specific hill. This is a south-facing hill, so south is this way behind me. And before we put the pond in, this area was so dry that it was basically just bare dirt. I couldn't keep grass alive here. I couldn't do anything. It was basically just a grass hill, and it would always dry out and die. It was getting full sun, and because it's on a hill, it was losing all its water through drainage as well. So how on earth can a plant survive in that? So creating some thermal mass with a bunch of rocks put here has really turned a dead area of my land into probably one of the most stable ecosystems that I have, planted out to tons of native wildflowers for the insects. And this is probably one of the most important places on my whole entire property. So with a little bit of addition of rocks, which also will kind of impact the water flow off of the hill, it'll stop and hold and dam the water kind of like a swale will. And it creates that thermal moderation. And that really has allowed different plants to have stable enough conditions that they grow really well. And you can see that even just that, you know, I would never see this amount of green growth if I didn't put in all this thermal mass. Now here is another kind of its own microclimate that I've added into my property after this year from some comments from viewers, is I've put in some bare soil, fairly compacted areas. I had to dig out a little bit of a trench to run the electrical for the pond pumps down here. And when I did that, I disturbed the soil, and I was going to sow back into it with clover. Instead, I actually tamped it down and compacted it, and I left it bare. And the reason I did that is that a lot of native bees will actually nest in bare soil, and they want it hot, they want it compacted, and they don't want it mulched. So it's important to include a little bit of that as well into your food forest. It's a little microclimate, not for plants, but for insects. The other thing that I really like about creating all these little rock work microclimates is that they just add so much interest. They add so many little nooks and crannies that end up getting their own feel to them. And certain plants will just really show up and adore the little areas that you set up. Additions of little logs and things like that, which will be home for beetles, can really help create a nice interest, diversity, and character to your land. You know, what good is just a bunch of veggies in rows when you can create all these little microclimates and nooks and crannies for things to really take root and set hold in. And you'll see that even under my fruit trees, I'll throw the odd rock in there. I'll throw the odd rock that'll collect and hold some sun, keep that area of ground nice and thermally moderated. And I'll sneak that kind of stuff in just all over the place. We'll put little fallen logs in for insect habitat, a little stump for beetles. Don't forget to add all this little tiny details into your food forest. Little rock right next to the peach tree where we've had, you know, some critters use that as the entrance to a little lair of theirs. And that thermal moderation of that rock has created a little climate that the strawberries have really liked. And they've done really well, even competing with stuff in the mint family like this creeping Charlie. But they've really liked the rock, not so much just a little bit past the rock, but they really enjoyed creeping up right up against this rock. These little microclimates, microclimates can do really well and be very productive. Look at all this water, thermally moderated from the water and the rocks. And we've got a pawpaw tree right here. And you've got the ground cover of strawberries that are really enjoying this spot here. And they didn't really like where I planted them out here, but they creeped along the water's edge, and then they spread all down in here where maybe it's just a little bit more thermally moderated. Okay, the last one I want to talk about is windbreaks. Now, windbreaks are going to be, as I mentioned before, typically on the north side of your property or the east or the west, depends on where your prevailing winds come from. And blocking that with two ways. One is a hill. Anytime you have a hill coming down, the winds will kind of blow up over and they'll eventually settle down in the lower areas, but at the ground level, some of the plants will get a bit of a break, specifically from really cold northern winds. And then the second would be trees and bushes and hedgerows, obviously. This lower area of my property is actually somewhat warmer in the deep late winter time than my upper areas, because they've got this big row of cedars on the north side of the lower area, and that blocks a lot of the northern winds coming and hitting down there. So I've talked about this a lot in my videos, but this is my fig, and my fig, I'm really pushing the zone on it. So I want to block northern winds, and I want to have it in full sun, and I want to thermally moderate around it. So lots of rock, lots of water, a hill on the north side. This is the location that I chose for my fig, and it has done fantastic. As you can see, this is actually coming into its, I believe its second year now. So it's already survived one round of -40 degree winters, and hopefully another one this year. So that is it for thermal mass, water, sun, and wind, creating microclimates on your property. Remember, there's 48 possible combinations. You can use each one differently. Wind will wick away moisture, so you're going to want to add in maybe some shade to help prevent evaporation, maybe add some thermal mass. Or if you can't do those things, maybe block that wind and keep that moisture in your soil. So look for areas in your land where you can make tweaks and modifications in order to create a little bit of a microclimate where you can maybe push the zone and grow some really neat things. There's some extreme examples of this, like the guy growing oranges in Nebraska, using like a sunken thermal mass greenhouse. You can take it to extremes, but you can also do it just in small little ways, like putting rocks in your garden, putting in a little micro pond, that kind of thing. Happy gardening, and I will see you on the next one.